is Kay Cotan. Welcome to this on-demand webinar for Being the Church in the Post-Pandemic World. Glad you were able to join me today. Today, we are going to be talking about the abrupt change in the church that we had to make once the pandemic hit. The now what? Then we're going to go into the 8 game changers that I think that churches are going to have to make in their leadership in our post-pandemic world, and then talk about next steps, and then the bonus area of the book. So let's go on and get started. Albert Einstein said, "In the midst of every crisis lies such great opportunity." And while the pandemic was certainly a horrible thing that hit our world, it is certainly a great opportunity if we were to take advantage of it. We won't know the full effects of the pandemic for years, if not decades to come, but it has created a great opportunity for the church if we choose to take advantage of it. That the choice is yours as church leaders if you're going to take advantage of that or not. Now, when the pandemic first hit, first of all, we proved as a church that we could indeed change. So often we talk about, the church being unwilling or unable to change, but I think we proved ourselves wrong, because there are so many churches that went online in less than a week's time. In one Sunday, they were only in the building, and the next Sunday, they were only online. So we made a very quick change in a very short amount of time. We certainly expected the pandemic to be a very short-term kind of situation, but as we know, it drug on for more than 2 years. We adopt new things when we're ready to, when there's a sense of urgency. But a lot of times we innovate when there is something that we're wanting to do ahead of time. So in other words, when we have to make a change, because we have no other choice, that's really adapting. But when we are doing something because we want to be ahead of the curve, because we're thinking creatively, then that is really innovating. So did your church really adapt, or did your church innovate as a result of the pandemic or since the pandemic? After that initial rally cry, after some of us either adapted or innovated, we had this second wave of just weariness. That was a word that I heard week after week after week, because I think we did this real big push of change, and then when we thought it was going to be short term and it wasn't, and we knew that this was going to go on for quite some time, there was just this weariness that had set in, and I'm not sure we all went in with a full tank anyway. And so when we were doing many more things, adding to, then there was a weariness that certainly that set in. When some of us left the building, did we experience a time of interruption or disruption? Think about a remote control. You have a favorite program that's running, and you hit the pause button to maybe head down the hall. An interruption is kind of like that. You hit the pause button, and you're going to come back and resume right where you picked up. And many churches did just that. They hit the pause button when they were no longer in the building for a certain amount of time. And when they came back, they wanted everything to be just like it was when they came back, even though the world around us was not the same. A disruption, on the other hand, is when you're going to start brand new, a fresh slate, clean board, if you will. And this time, this crisis gave us the opportunity for a disruption. The pandemic was certainly a disruption, even though many churches treated it as an interruption. So again, that's an opportunity that has been given to us had we been willing to take it. Kind of our thinking about all of this is, did we take this as a time of, just adapting because we had to, and we pushed the pause button and went back to everything? Or did we take it as the true disruption that it was, and the opportunity by being innovative, not going back, and that it was a time of disruption, and we started with a clean slate? For example, some churches went online to only serve, existing members. They didn't see it as, we're going online, and gosh, this is a great opportunity to reach new people as well. So those are some of the examples I mean by, just a great opportunity that was before us as we made this abrupt change to go into a different mode before us. So once we went through this whole thing of a new way of being, and we had this rally cry, then it was, now what? Of forming and developing the post-pandemic church with intentional, strategic steps to be more faithful in fulfilling the disciple-making mission. Again, that is thinking of this as a disruption and not an interruption, starting with a clean slate. That how can we look at everything with a critical eye and saying, is this an effective way to reach new people? Is this ministry, program, event helping us in making new disciples? Are we relaunching in ways that are more effective than maybe they were in the past? Are we letting go of things that didn't work or no longer work, that we just need to look at differently? The pandemic did not cause church issues. It only accelerated what was already in process. Time to face the music, friends, and have hard, overdue conversation. It just catapulted us 10 years into the future. It didn't cause anything. It just accelerated what was already going on in the life of the church. So now let's look at the 8 game changers that I think that we are having to face in church leadership, that the pandemic has forced us to look at. Not that we didn't need to look at these before, but we can no longer ignore these leadership traits. As we think about these 8 game changers, the first one is flexibility. And number one is number one for a reason. We have to be at a place of being much more flexible and nimble. The church is a movement, and the ministries are about how we make disciples. The ministries are not about the sacredness of this is what we do. What we do is making disciples. How we do it needs to remain flexible. The church is not a specific date, time, and place with a program, right? The church is the congregation. We have to lose that tendency of the church to be rigid and stagnant that we sometimes are. Instead, we have to be pliable and supple and open and adjustable. Most other organizations were much more that way even prior to the pandemic. And some churches already were leaning that way, and some learned to be that way during the pandemic. Here are some examples that we're going to look at from a standpoint of being flexible. These aren't all of them, certainly, that are offered in the book, but this gives you some examples of how we have to live into being more flexible. First of all, we have to think about worship as being on-site and online both. It's not either or, but it's both and. And we have to think about it from the perspective of those that are already here, and more importantly, those that are not yet here, which means that if our purpose is to make disciples, then the personal preferences of those that are already there cannot take precedent over those that are not yet there, especially if we're trying to reach a different demographic. And if we're no longer a representation of those that are in our mission field that surround the church, it's probably going to take even more getting out of our comfort zone in the way that we worship if we're going to reach a different demographic, a more diverse demographic than what we are. A lot of times we become very homogenous in a very diverse world. Many of our churches went back and resumed the very ministries that they were already doing, which was probably the worst thing we could have done. It was a great time to look at every ministry and see if it was effective. It was a great time to do some funerals for some ministries that were long overdue. Are the ministries effective or not? Again, ministries were a tool for how we make disciples. It shouldn't be, this is what we've always done and will always do. So every time that we decide to do a ministry, we should say, why are we doing this? What's its intended purpose, its outcome, and how are we going to measure its effectiveness? And then once we conduct that ministry, then do an evaluation. Did it meet those benchmarks? Why or why not? Did it serve its purpose? And then if we were to do it again, what kind of tweaks would we make? We often feel like a busy church is an effective church, which is not at all the case. And sometimes we have very busy churches that they are not making disciples. They're simply just burning out people. And so we're finding that churches that go deep in a signature ministry, if you will, instead of going wide, meaning doing a lot of different things, but not building relationships, not having handoff events that flow with the same demographic. They're just doing what I call a shotgun approach, are not nearly as effective. And I know it feels counterintuitive, but what's your niche demographic you're trying to reach with a signature ministry, and you'll be much more effective and you won't burn people out nearly as much. We also have to be flexible with our leadership. Our leadership really should first and foremost be our mature disciples who are modeling what mature discipleship looks like, who are living out their vows. They need to be bold and courageous leaders. They need to be change advocates, not resistant to change. A leader should not be in a chair because of their last name or whose name is on the church sign, but because of their mature discipleship, and that they are truly living out what it looks like to be more Christ-like each and every day. And that they are modeling what it means not only to be a disciple, but a disciple-making disciple, that they're bringing new people to know Christ. They need to be authentic as a leader, showing vulnerability. And we're even seeing shifts in churches of moving away from those specialties of nominations of of HR and buildings and finance, because those are secondary to first being a mature disciple. When we have only secular experience sitting at the table making decisions, but we don't have mature disciples, we often are not leading missional churches. We're leading the business side, but we're not leading in the spiritual side, nor leading with an eye towards making disciples. So it is extremely important to have agile, mature, authentic, bold, and courageous leaders in our post-pandemic churches. I think we have to be flexible in the way we're defining church. It's a movement. We're seeing churches move away from being Sunday-centric, from being pastor-centric, and a whole lot of other ways of being so specific with what we're defining church as. Church is a movement, and it's the people, and it's about our mission of making disciples. It's not about the methods, which means our budget is going to have to be rethought. And how is the budget being leveraged? Because that's an asset. How is our budget being leveraged towards making disciples? I often see budgets that have less than 5% for the ministry of making disciples. If that's our very purpose, but such a small percentage, and a lot of times it's a lot less than that, but we're not using any of our budget towards that, then I think we have to re-examine what it is that we think church is about. What's really sacred? And what's really about tradition. Not that there's anything wrong with tradition, but if tradition is getting in the way, that we become rigid in the tradition instead of rigid in our mission of making disciples, then I think we've gotten kind of mixed up in our priorities. So the flexibility has to be there in really understanding that the word is sacred. We're to go and make disciples, that's sacred, but everything else really needs to be flexible. And those churches that are finding themselves to be flexible are the ones that are being effective in reaching new people. The second game changer is relational. This is one that I think is where we have a whole lot of work to do. We're in the relationship business. There are actually 15 different key shifts of relational work that I think that we need to do. I'm going to offer you 4 different kind of examples of the shifts that I think that we need to do. One of them is we have become very program driven in many churches. It's all about, what's our next new program that we're going to do. Again, it was all about, keeping the lights on. And as long as, the lights were on and people were coming and going, then we were effective. But that isn't the case, and we're not seeing as many people come to the building. We're not seeing as many people, that want to engage in the life of the church. And again, we're a movement into the community. We act as though we're still living in a culture that is centered on the church, which is not the case. In 2020, we were, for the first time in history, we fell below the 50% mark at 47% of our U.S. population says that they have some sort of a spiritual home. They belong to some sort of spiritual community. That is down from 70% at just the turn of the century. That is a steep decline in a short amount of years. Now, were all of them attending? No, but they felt like they still had that anchor. And there's so many that aren't even, claiming that anymore. So we have to understand that we have to go back to our roots and become a movement again and do life out in the community and reach people where they are instead of expecting them to come to us. Building relationships with people in the community who are unchurched, and it starts with relationships. It's not, inviting them to church. That's just not a normal way of evangelism anymore. We have to build authentic, truthful relationships so that we might be able to share our faith. And inviting them to church is way on down the line now as a way of evangelizing. We have become, as I mentioned earlier, very homogenous in most of our churches, by and large. Many of our churches are, white, middle class America. And that is not a reflection of the melting pot of America. And so to really be the church of the postmodern, post-COVID world, we have to be multicultural and multi-generational. And that is not what we are today. And to be able to do that, we're going to have to be emotionally intelligent, culturally intelligent, congregations in order to cross what are barriers right now in order for us to be able to do that kind of ministry. I kind of covered this already, to move from an attractional. Surely if we just have the right program, surely if we just have the right worship experience, and we're going to open the doors and they're going to come. That is a very, very, very minute amount of our churches that can really depend on that kind of ministry model. The majority of churches cannot. We have to understand that we have to be a dispatched movement into our community, making an impact, which again takes us away from our insular, just being there taking care of one another, to culturally competent, so that we can understand as we become a dispatched movement that we are culturally competent, culturally intelligent, in order to build relationships with those that don't do life the same way, that think differently, do differently, have different dreams, different fears than maybe that we do, because they're in different cultures, different life segments, different ethnicities, different lifestyles, and so on. So that just gives you just a snippet of some of the shifts we need to make relationally to lead churches in different ways. We have to know our community. We should be experts at our community and relate to our community in a much deeper way, which means we have to invest in our community with our time, our energy, and our relationships. Let's look at this next piece. We're going to have to be much more visionary as leaders in our post-COVID world. In the post-COVID world, to be visionary means that we're going to have a different vision for the church, the community, and the people. Every church has the same mission, and that's the Great Commission of making disciples. But each church lives out and does their mission in a different way, and that is reflected through their vision. And vision is unique in different seasons of the life of the church, because vision is born through what it is, the impact that you're going to have in the community. Some would say it's your congregational call, it's the problem you're going to solve, it's the need you're going to take care of, it's the gap that you're going to close in the community, but it's very community-centric. And it is the giftedness of your congregation to meet that need, to close that gap, to solve that problem. And then it is the passions of the leaders that are going to lead that movement to use the giftedness of your congregation to solve that problem. So vision comes from the Venn diagram, if you will, of those three things. So vision typically has to change in our times now every couple of years. And it's the unique way that your church is making disciples. So what a vision means for the church then is, what is God's preferred future as you uniquely live out the church? For the community, this would be, how is your church creating a positive impact? How is your community different because the church is there? How are you weaving your life and the life of the church into the community to provide that positive impact? What's different because your church is there and serving the community? How are you having a heart for the community? And what are you doing that is showing the community that you care about them and that there's different? What are you known for in the community? A lot of times we're known for what we're against, much more so than what we are for. A lot of times we're known as the hypocrites, right? Because I think we don't necessarily get out there and do positive things in ways that are relational. A lot of times we do things at arm's length. Now, what kind of vision do you have for the people? How are individual lives in your community being transformed because the church is there and you as people are there serving? You have to have a heart for the people. And how are their lives being transformed because of that? Going back to, thinking a little bit more flexible, are you thinking about how are we providing experiences like worship experiences and ministries for the people that we're intersecting with? What are their hopes? What are their dreams? How are we showing them love? How are we showing them peace? And we won't know that until we're out there and we're showing them love and compassion. And only then will we know what their needs are and ways to help them. And then, and only then, would we be able to share our faith with them because we've built up trust with them and they're willing to listen. Let's look at this next area, the different way that we're going to have to show up in the post-pandemic world as the church. Spiritually grounded. Now, I think this probably would go without saying, but it isn't always the case. Here are 4 examples of ways that I think we're going to have to be spiritually grounded. One of those is grounded in prayer. Does your church start everything with prayer? And I don't mean, the pastor, has to start every meeting with prayer. But for example, does someone in your church say, please keep me, in your prayers as, you might say, how are you doing? How was your week? Oh, so-and-so, is having surgery. Would you keep us in your prayers? Instead of just saying that, do you stop and say, let's pray right now? Or do you enter into a time of prayer and discernment when you have a big decision to make? Or is it just those times that you feel like you have to pray because it's on the agenda and it's only the pastor that prays, nobody else is comfortable? Is it just not the joys and concerns of those that are already there? Or do you have prayer teams that, are praying for the church and what we're being called to do and the community and who God's calling us to reach? Is there spiritual depth? Are we intentionally discipling people? First, those that are already there, are there intentional steps to help them grow more Christ-like? And that's just not head knowledge. I think we think about this as curriculum and helping people know the stories, and that's important. But are we seeing shifts in behavior and and how they're doing life. Their lifestyle is changing. There's a transformation of the heart that is occurring. And as they mature as disciples, they become disciple makers, which means they're inviting others into the life of the church. And as mature disciples, we get to the point of knowing that it's no longer about us, and our personal preference are put aside because we know that it's most important for more people to come to know Christ. Are leaders modeling this spiritual depth and being grounded in prayer? And are we putting those leaders in charge of things? Or do we have leaders who are leading because of other reasons, not because they're spiritually mature? Are we being intentional in the way that we are helping people grow intentionally? Do we have a discipleship pathway where everyone is on a discipleship pathway, always looking to take that next step in their discipleship pathway, growing more and more Christ-like? And are we helping new people take a step onto the discipleship pathway? Do we have mature spiritual leaders who are helping and mentoring people? This isn't about membership. This is about spiritual depth, growing in our discipleship. This is about, commitment and serving, and generosity, dependability. And as we have this modeled by leadership, then spiritually mature leaders are more generous, more dependable. They're more bold in their leadership, and they serve by taking more risk, because they're grounded in a faith that believes in abundance and not scarcity. So, how spiritually grounded? Now, you'll notice in each of these slides that there is this bar that is 0 to 10. As we've gone through each of these, I hope you've been kind of thinking about, where do you think your church is on that continuum? How would you rate your church in each of these categories? So as you are moving through this, kind of be rating your church in each of these categories of how spiritually grounded or flexible or relational or visionary is your church. And we'll tell you what to do with that here at the end. Now, the next leadership trait is about commitment. And there's kind of like 3 different areas of commitment. Sammy Davis Jr. said this: you always have 2 choices, your commitment versus your fear. And so often we don't always lead towards our commitment, do we? Now, as we think about these 3 areas of our commitment, when we think about our commitment to Christ, then we align all of our resources to the mission of making disciples. All of our resources, the facility, the budget, our time, our energy, all of the activities that we do, our calendaring, and all of that is in our decisions, right? How are all of that, are we doing our very best to provide the biggest impact to making disciples? All that we're doing is helping people mature in their discipleship, or we're reaching new people that are becoming disciples of Christ. Are we committed to that? Or is it really about something else? Are we a country club? Much more so than we are about our commitment to Christ. The next is our commitment to the church, to be a faith community. In our book of discipline, which is our polity book, if you will, it says this in paragraph 121, which I think just really sums it up. It says, whenever United Methodism has had a clear sense of mission, and our mission is to make disciples, right? God has used the church to save people, heal relationships, transform social structures, and spread scriptural holiness, therefore changing the world. But listen again to how it starts. Whenever United Methodism has had a clear sense of mission, it goes right back to mission. It's to be a faith community that is sold out on the mission. That's what a commitment to the church means. Now, this third area is a commitment to the community. When we have a commitment to the community, we are constantly looking outside first. The outside may look different than the inside. In most churches, it does. And when I say the outside, what is the immediate area, neighborhood around where your church is planted? And this is something bold that I often say to churches I'm working with. Because too many churches have become what I call drive-in churches. People once lived in the neighborhood and now they've moved further away, but they drive in to the church on Sunday. So they spend an hour or two in the neighborhood just to visit the facility on Sunday, but they don't do life there. They don't shop. They don't eat there. They don't live there, right? So they're only coming there to visit the building, but they have no commitment to that neighborhood. That church was planted there to serve that neighborhood. If your church is no longer able or willing to serve that community, then we need to turn the keys over to a congregation that is, because that church was anointed and called to serve that community. So we have to constantly be saying, are we a reflection of our community? Are we impacting our community in a positive way? Our lives being transformed because of our community. But in order to have that kind of impact and understand that, we have to have a firm commitment to the community, and they have to be a priority and a priority over our existing people. If we have a priority over existing people, we'll always take care of our existing people. But if we have a priority over existing people, what I find is we will never have time for the people who aren't yet there. The sixth area is innovation. And innovation just really causes us to have to think in a very different way, because the church is not one that we necessarily think about as being innovative. We don't often think about church equals innovation. When we think about innovation, we think that that's for other organizations, but because we have been so stuck in our ways, we're going to have to catapult 10, 15, 20 years in order to just kind of be relevant for today, not even to really get ahead. So to think about innovation, we first have to be thinking about this from an investment standpoint. So there are many, many organizations who have up to 30 to 40% of their budget that they invest in R&D, research and development. Imagine that, some as much as even 45%. There is no such thing as failure, but when we try things and they didn't work like we thought they would or that we wanted them to, there's learning in that. And so have you considered maybe having an innovation budget, an innovation line in your budget, so that you could try new things and always know that we need to fail fast is what we say, right? Innovate, try new things, and nothing is forever, right? Try it. If it doesn't work, then try something else. Innovation is not something that's just something shallow, but it can be something that is very profound, and it can be transformational. Innovation is no longer a choice. but it's imperative. This is when we go back to, what was it that we did? Innovation is about that disruption, not interruption. It is about, that voluntary kind of innovation. It isn't that we have to change because now we're forced to, because we're in the late stages of our life cycle, so we have to change, or we're not going to make it. This is about building a culture of experimentation. This isn't about just giving a couple of people a couple of bucks, but it's a culture that you're trying to build. Again, ministries are temporary. Methods are temporary. It's the how, right? Digital, so think, physically in the building and digital. It's both and. We're going to reach more people, and there's more of the mission field is online than not. And so are we thinking about that as a way to reach new people? So many churches have thought of it as a way to keep in touch with the people that were already gathered while we were out of the building. Unfortunately, too many of them stopped doing that when they moved back in the building. So whoever they had maybe reached during that time, accidentally, they just left them behind. We have to think both and. Now, if you're a small church and we don't have the resources to do that, then gather other small churches together and share the responsibility for that, or use resources from other large churches, or see if you can resource from large churches and stream some of theirs. I mean, there are ways to do it that are not costly. If you have a desire to do it, you'll figure out a way to do it. We also have to think creatively beyond the offering plate. Many churches are already there, and most churches are knowing they're needing to get there. The offering plate is not going to be able to sustain us as the only income stream going forward. We have become way too clergy dependent, and we're going to have to think about this in different ways. The clergy are more and more expensive just because the cost of salaries and housing and benefits. And so we're going to have to step up as laity, which is the way it started to begin with, as a laity movement, which bivocational, and bivocational means intentionally. The pastor works another job and then offers the word on Sunday, or part-time ministry, but that's intentional because the pastor then is out in the secular world that has the opportunity to be introduced to new people. But that isn't temporary until the church is big enough to support a pastor full-time, but it's intentional because their foot is in the secular world as well. There is also intentional in the way that we think about mature disciples leading in a way that is part of the way that they serve, as opposed to, well, we just hire our ministry to be done for us. Leaders create capacity, not dependence on themselves. Visionary leaders create great culture. They create culture of innovation and hospitality, and they create a culture around values of innovation. Think about innovation as in even how we share what we're doing, and how we communicate. Even Wesley was an innovator. When Wesley saw a need, he then innovated ways to take care of that need. So for instance, when there were children that lost parents, what did he do? He built an orphanage, right? When there were sick that needed to be cared for, what did he do? He built hospitals, which created jobs and multiple income streams. He was one of the first publishers. It created jobs and multiple income streams. And I mean, there were schools that were Methodist schools. So this is in our roots. Wesley did this and it was a way to cross over the secular as well. And it was good for the community, good for the church, and good for us to blur the lines of the church and secular in ways that we could do life with one another, where we could be raw and real and be authentic with one another. This is a way that we're going to have to embrace innovation, because it is the world as we live it today. We have to encourage it by being leaders that encourage innovation, by putting it in the budget, by being flexible. We go back to number one, in the way that we approve new ministries, that it doesn't take 6 or 8 months to actually get something new approved, that it becomes part of who we are, that we intentionally innovate and we come to expect innovation. It's not just something that we do by happenstance, but it's actually something that is expected of our congregation, that we're going to be innovators and we're going to experiment. And it's okay if it doesn't work, because we're going to learn from it and then we'll move on. The next one is resilience. We're going to have to be very resilient leaders in our post-pandemic world. We cannot, as leaders, allow setbacks to keep them down. I found some churches that are in decline, or have been in decline, or maybe even moving towards death. That they are just, as an organization, they're living in a state of depression, and they've grown apathetic. And it's really hard to get something going when you're in that state. Resilient churches are led by resilient leaders. We have to act on opportunities that come before us. Sometimes we're reluctant, and because we're reluctant, we don't act on them at all, or sometimes we're so slow to act on them that the opportunity passes us by. Resilient leaders are positive. They live and believe in a life of abundance, not of scarcity. They look at what we have, not at what we don't have. They're scrappy, if you will. Resilient leaders are encouragers. They have endurance. They're hopeful. They're tenacious. They offer constructive criticism, right? They're not afraid to say, this is what's going wrong, but they're going to be encouragers of how we can do something even better. Resilient leaders become resilient by weathering storms, not by avoiding them, right? A really great book to live into resilience is Tempered Resilience by Todd Bolsinger. At times of crisis or crossroads of change, anxious relationship systems default back to what is known, believing that it is the only path to self-preservation and survival, even if it means returning to slavery. Exodus 6:13. Leadership is about change. There's a crisis of leadership. Organizations resist the leader and they actually brought to help them change. Isn't that true? Sometimes we ask for new pastors because, something is really going on in the life of the church. And then we ask for a new leader, they bring us change. And then when they do, then what do? we attack them, and then we ask for another change in pastors. Are we doing that? Are we having a crisis of leadership? So how resilient is your leadership in your church? The final one here is around courage. So how courageous are your leaders and your congregation? When we think about courage, we think about having tough conversations. As a church, we don't always embrace tough conversations. We sometimes think that, we have to play nice. And so playing nice means that we avoid conflict, we avoid the tough conversations. What that means is that we don't avoid them, but instead we actually run towards the conversations. Having conflict does not mean that we are a unhealthy church. If you don't have conflict, that means you're playing it really safe. No conflict means you're unhealthy, but it's how you handle it that makes the real difference. And so, are we really addressing the bullies? Which means, are we allowing the bullies to have their way, or are we going to them saying, this is not right, and we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. This is not Christian behavior. Are we going to allow employees to rule the roost, even if they're not aligned with our mission and vision? I've seen that happen as well. We just avoid the tough conversations because we think we have to have this niceness culture. But that is not the way that it's called for to do life in the church. We have to be willing to have those tough conversations. When we don't, we become very unhealthy, and most of your healthy people are going to leave. And it's only going to leave the unhealthy people, or the ones that are just there to come on Sunday and leave. They don't want to be involved, and they're just going to turn a blind eye to it. So we have to have the courage to have those tough conversations. We have to have the courage of a planter. There's no leader that's more courageous than a church planter. There's a lot of risk in planting. And so we have to have the courage of a planter, to go out and build new relationships, be out in the community and network and try new things, because we just don't know what's going to work. We also have to have the vulnerability of an explorer. There are new contexts out there. It's a new world. Everything has changed, which means we're going to have to be vulnerable to have conversations with people who are not like us, who have different thoughts, who have different lifestyles, who are at different season in their life, different generations, different ethnicities, different beliefs. But we have to be vulnerable to that since we're called to reach people for Christ. And we have to have passion as a follower of Christ. And that passion drives us to have courage, because God will be with us in all things that we do. And so when we're a passionate follower of Christ, then, friends, we will have the courage to do what God is calling us to do. So be sure that you have gotten your book, first of all, because as you can imagine, not all of the pieces of all of the 8 game changers of what we need to be as leaders in this post-pandemic world have been covered. So grab a book, go through the entire chapter. At the end of each chapter, then do the assessment of where you think your church is in that particular leadership trait. Then gather a small group and compare those assessment numbers, and then process the questions at the end of each chapter. It'll help you all dig deeper into the whys of how people kind of put a lens towards that particular leadership quality. Then compare those different process numbers, those different evaluation numbers, and then see if any of your numbers change. At the end of the book, there's a summary of all 8 of the game changer titles, and then put the assessment number that you land on as a group in each of those. Then I want you to take the highest score, and that's what you're going to build on. We want you to build and lead from your strengths, not your weaknesses. So what are those top 2 or 3 areas that boy, we're really courageous and flexible, for example? So how can you use those strengths to take your church to the next level? And then what's that third one? And then maybe those that have those traits that you score lower in, how can you bring them into leadership to start building the culture around some of those strengths as well? There's also then a call to action around each of those different leadership traits. So then based on your strengths and your assessments, then what is your action plan? What are you going to do with all of this information and the assessments and what you've learned to make your church even more effective in reaching new people in this post-pandemic world? And then come back to it after you've completed that action plan, and then choose your next action plan. This is something that you can continue to come back to for 2 or 3 seasons. There's enough here to mine for sure in those 8 different leadership traits. Also, there is a bonus section in this book, Being the Church in the Post-Pandemic World. It's called the Ultimate Relaunch Playbook. It's a way for us to think about how could we relaunch our church into the community in a way that's meaningful for not only the congregation, but even more so for the community. It's a way to show the community that, we're here for you. We want to impact the community, make a difference. We're listening to you. And again, it's a playbook. It is a step-by-step process on how to relaunch your church into the community in meaningful ways. So you might check that out as well. It's a section in the back of the book. If you want to take deeper dives into the opportunity presented here in Being the Church in the Post-Pandemic World, I'm also running cohorts from time to time, or maybe your district or conference would be interested in putting several churches together in cohorts to do this experience together. And I also do coaching for one-on-one groups in churches that are wanting to take a deeper dive into this. So I hope this has been helpful for you to think about what are the leadership traits that we need to think about for being the church in the post-pandemic world to be more effective in our mission of making disciples. Thanks for joining me, and look for webinars just like this to help you be a more effective leader in your church. For joining me.